Minnesota, home to 10,000 lakes and 2 amusement parks, Valleyfair in Shopahee, Minnesota, and one only 20 minutes away, Nickelodeon Universe in Mall of America. But let's go back 50 years. 50 years ago, Minnesota only had one park, and this park unfortunately closed down before any of these 2 parks opened. Hey guys, welcome back North Star Coasters, and joining me today is Coaster Key. So a big thank you to him, and you can check out his channel in the description box down below. But with that said, join us as we uncover the history of Excelsior Amusement Park. Before Excelsior Amusement Park ever opened, there's actually one park that preceded it, and that was Wonderland Amusement Park in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This park was very small, and it was only open from 1905 to 1911 due to some lawsuit that would close the park down in 1911, and some of the rides actually ended up in Excelsior Amusement Park. Perhaps the biggest issue with Wonderland was that it was located right smack dab in Minneapolis, and this is where neighborhoods were beginning to develop. So many residents frequently complained about the noises and screams from the park, which led to the lawsuit, which led to the park shutting down for good. And for a little over a decade, Minnesota was without an amusement park to call its own. That was until Fred W. Pierce opened a park called Excelsior Amusement Park in 1925 on Excelsior Bay at Lake Minnetonka. And unlike Wonderland, this park was located in the quiet countryside of the western part of the Twin Cities. The park officially opened on May 30th, 1925, with 20,000 people visiting the park. And this leads us to the second part of this video. On opening day, there is many attractions to choose from that families and thrill seekers could all enjoy. First, there was the Carousel, which was a typical amusement park ride at the time, and it was built by PTC, otherwise known as Philadelphia Toboggan Company. There was also Custer cars, which were mini hot rod racers that guests could drive around a small track in the park. And there is also the aerial swings, which were essentially an older version of flying scooters, or flying eagles. Back then, these rides were very popular, and even to this day, these kind of rides still retain their popularity, showing that this ride is still a huge crowd pleaser. Next was the Caterpillar, which was a ride that took guests in a circular motion at a decently high speed, and there were even little bumps that gave guests a little bit of airtime here and there. The park also featured a mini railroad ride, which took guests around the park, and there was also scooters, which were basically bumper cars. The park also had a Ferris wheel, which was a huge crowd pleaser, and also gave great views of Lake Minnetonka. And later on, the park would add more rides, including a scrambler and a rocket ride. The park also had a funhouse, as well as many other entertainment options, including shows and a ballroom. And in the park's later years, it hosted many concerts, including the Beach Boys at one point.
What was likely the most notable ride at the park was the Cyclone, a coaster that opened with the park in 1925, which was built by Fred W. Pierce, a notable coaster builder and park operator at the time, and was also designed by Vernon Keenan, the same man who designed the famous Coney Island Cyclone. The ride itself used classic trains with a rather minimalistic restraint system, similar to that of many other classic coasters that were built at the time. The park owned 2 trains for this coaster, and it operated without much issues for many years since its opening. The layout originally had the lift hill appear in a different location inside the ride's main section, but was oddly moved over to outside the main area, closer to the lake, sometime in the ride's early history. But with this new setup, the ride started in a very interesting way by going over the water on Lake Minnetonka, where riders got a beautiful view of the lake and its early years of operation before climbing up the lift hill. The ride was reported to be about 65 feet tall with an unknown top speed or drop, though these stats seem to range from 60 to 50 miles per hour for the top speed and around 60 feet for the descent. After a 90-degree turn at the top, the ride would go down its main drop and then travel up a large hill followed by a sharp double down. The second drop on the double down seemed to have given some powerful airtime, potentially being the strongest on the ride, especially for back row riders. But after that, the ride would enter a turnaround before navigating another set of hills, which provided some additional fuller airtime before entering a 450-degree helix with minimal banking. To be honest, this section seemed to have been an excellent finale to the ride, with laterals capable of putting any CCI coaster to shame. But after that, the ride would suddenly hit the brakes, putting an end to a simple yet satisfying ride experience. Some changes would be made to the ride in later years, such as the over-the-water section being filled in and were claimed to expand the park. As well, the ride at one point also had its trains almost completely refurbished, but with all but the chassis being completely replaced with newer parts, on top of other maintenance improvements to help keep the aging ride operating. However, the ride would not stand forever, especially with all the issues the park had been facing in its later years.
The park gained popularity in the 1940s, and later on in the 1950s and 1960s, the park reached peak attendance, which at first was a really good thing, but it turned against them eventually. The park was usually very busy and at some times very crowded, and this park was also a very prime spot for teenage hangouts, and some of them were not obeying park rules and disrespecting the park's property. On top of that, the park couldn't expand. It was basically stuck as a small park that was getting big attendance almost too much for its own good. And this is because the Minneapolis and St. Paul area was experiencing a huge population growth in the 1960s. And as the urban areas began to fill up, many people were wanting to live in the suburbs, primarily on a lake place, and Lake Minnetonka was prime real estate. This caused higher taxes on Lake Minnetonka's plots of land. Not only that, but parking was also a huge issue, with businesses growing and neighborhoods being developed in the area. All of these issues eventually led to the park's owners to make a difficult decision, and that was to close the park for good. 1973 was the park's final season, and September 16th was the final day. After that, the park was eventually demolished. But not all was lost.
Despite the park's closure, not everything was lost to history. Right after the park's closure in 1973, the owners of the property purchased land at the town of Shakopee, where they planned to build a brand new park out of the ashes of the old demolished amusement park. Many of the rides from the old deteriorating park were relocated to this new park, including the park's old carousel, which was refurbished by Hopkins sometime between 1974 and 1975. This new park, known as Valleyfair, opened up for the 1976 season and drew decent crowds for its opening years. Though the signature Cyclone coaster was never saved, a spiritual successor with a similar but mirrored L-shaped path to the original opened up along with the park, known as High Roller. Though this ride had a different lift hill setup and lacked the helix or double down, the Cyclone's legacy still lives on this small but fun ride. I was even lucky enough to ride this coaster myself, which you can see a review of on my personal channel. Hashtag shameless plug. But 2 years after opening, the famous Cedar Point Amusement Park in Ohio bought this park and formed the Cedar Fair Company, which is now a major player in the industry today. So without this old and forgotten park, one of the biggest change, which housed some of your favorite parks, might have not been around the way we know it as today.
There were also other rides that were relocated to Valleyfair after Excelsior Park closed. For instance, the Ferris wheel. The Ferris wheel came from the Excelsior Amusement Park and is still operating to this day. And as the spirit of Excelsior Park lives on in Valleyfair, Valleyfair continues to grow and add more attractions and rides. They've added roller coasters throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and especially the early 2000s, as well as adding new thrill rides and family rides for kids to enjoy. Today, Valleyfair has grown into the largest park in the upper Midwest, and Valleyfair owes a lot of credit to the park that preceded it, and that is Excelsior Amusement Park. Without this old, forgotten park, Valleyfair would not be the same as it is today. And Excelsior's park's legacy will always live on to the people who got to experience it. To this day, people still remember all the fun memories they've had at Excelsior Amusement Park. So the next time you're at Valleyfair riding your favorite rides, you can thank Excelsior Amusement Park for making your day so much fun.